Welcome to the third season of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast where we explore the fascinating borderlands between science and theology through realms of philosophy, human experience, and more.
Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium, episode 122. This episode is a contemplation of the concept of original sin and comparison to modern ideas about psychology, the things that we inherit from our childhood, the things that we inherit as a weakness of our human nature, the things that we inherit as sort of maladjusted things from the lives that our distant ancestors used to live. We pull a lot of ideas together, think about them a bit, read from the Catechism actually for a while. Bill gets on me to the point that I need to make sure that I've gone back to the Catechism and pulled some authentic theology from there. So this is a little bit of everything about that concept of why we do the terrible things that we sometimes do. I hope you enjoy it.
So something else has reminded me a couple of things in the past month of something that I, first started thinking about years ago when I was, have you heard of Steven Pinker?
I have heard of that
He's
name,
a public
yes.
intellectual. He's an atheist. What is his actual specialty? I'm not even sure. He wrote a book called The Blank Slate, where he talks about how fellow leftists get a lot of things wrong because they assume that human nature can just be rewritten at will, which is absolutely not the case. And there's no science to, there's all sorts of scientific, observations to back up the fact that human beings act in certain ways. And that's how it is. There is, right. This is not quite his terminology, but there is such a thing as human nature, basically, is fundamentally what it is.
Right.
And it can't be distorted out of all. But in any case, in the course of listening to the first third of that audiobook before he became unlistenable because he started talking about politics and religion, and he's an awful person to listen to talk about politics and religion.
Oh, interesting.
Interesting. But he's talking about the concepts in evolutionary biology, which is this free-for-all where people sort of attribute to their god, evolution, all sorts of miraculous, wonderful things that may or may not really be the case. But there is some, there is at least some reasonable speculation that goes on there about things like, the humans, there is a human nature, and it was forged to get us through tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps, of living in a hunter-gatherer type existence. And so there are things that are, in groups of, I don't know, dozens, maybe. I'm not familiar with the archaeology on that, but, settlements of maybe that size, probably no more than 1,000 for sure. And so, what got groups through, what got groups of human beings through, what individual human behaviors and tendencies got groups of human beings through that period really doesn't necessarily serve us even at the level of agricultural civilization, let alone the internet. And so,
the global society,
yeah. I mean, that's one of the things. And then there's simply the fact that whenever you have something, anything can go wrong. In any animal, any living thing, it has. It has systems at the cellular level, tissue level, organ level, system level that can go wrong, period. I mean, that simply happens. Between those two observations, I started to think, I wonder if there's some connection between our Christian concept of original sin and some of these other concepts. I mean, especially the idea that we're set up for an existence that we no longer live. The kind of, crude violence to outsiders, let us say, to take one, our tendency to simply, at a very basic level, separate people into in-groups and out-groups. And, we can modify that behavior. And certainly the Christian religion encourages us to, sand the sharp, nasty points off of that as best we can. Yet there's still, it's just there. That's something that we do, that tendency is just very, very strong. And it's an open question whether anyone ever actually gets rid of it, or if they just modify it to the point that everyone can be in a group. Maybe that's what we need the demons for. Maybe we have to have them to be our out group.
Now that's interesting. Right. Isn't it true that human nature? It seems as though societies need enemies to motivate their pulling together to cooperate. Huh?
Happens so often, doesn't
it? We spend a lot of time. Yes, and I do find that. I guess that is an element of original sin. The tribal approach, and of course, I guess, obviously, the original sin was in the Garden of Eden, but the first sign of cancel culture, or the first sense of demonization, or trying to find a competitive advantage, was only in the next generation. It was the Cain and Abel story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it escalated quickly, didn't it?
Things devolved pretty quickly.
They sure did. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, I do like the idea of how does original sin and our lack of ability to understand and have compassion for basic human nature, which, by the way, I think really does include having a God-sized hole inside of us that has to be filled somehow.
Mm-hmm.
How does the totality of human nature, integrate itself into how we're expected to live today? Especially if we're stopping our belief in God, or so many of us are nuns. And, we think of ourselves as God or as the sources of truth. One thing original sin requires is some sense of forgiveness and compassion, and getting back on the right track, which can be done as easily as being baptized. At least we shed the original sin at that point, right?
Right.
If nobody is adhering even to those very basic processes of sin management, I've never used that term before.
There you go.
I like the idea of sin management. What do you think?
Only to be done by qualified professionals, i.e. Jesus Christ. But yeah. He has to be involved.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Human beings cannot be. Yeah. I don't think God offers a certificate program.
No.
That we could take in sin management.
Not in management.
I am interested in hearing more about how that topic kind of arose as a timely concern for you. And did you see it in a particular life circumstance, or is it part of reading that you're doing?
Reading/listening to for the most part. Certainly I'm reading or listening to them because they're relevant to my life, but so back in, I don't remember if it was late January, the very beginning of February, I'll leave the parish and the name of the priest nameless. I'm in the greater St. Louis area now. There's somebody who's now a bit of a throwback. He is a retired priest, which, this is a great, there are 3 priests of this parish, and I don't think that's even abnormal. Now, one of them is senior pastor and one of them is retired. But nevertheless, it's, coming from Indianapolis where things are a little sad in terms of number of priests.
Yeah.
St. Louis seems like a richer environment. I was actually just listening to the Catholic radio station here in town because I finally noticed the sign for it outside adoration on Friday night.
No, I'd be interested. That's probably a fairly robust Catholic station in St. Louis.
Yeah. They were interviewing a couple of seminarians who are probably, have been like fourth year, or probably about to be ordained deacons. I wouldn't swear to it, but I didn't catch all the conversation. But, listening to them talk about, their experiences in the seminary, their call to the priesthood and things like that. So that was, there's just a sense of things being a little bit more robust here, that things are a little bit more lively than they are in Indianapolis, unfortunately. But but anyway, there are 3 priests at our parish, and the outright retired one is a bit of a throwback to, like, I'd say the 60s and 70s, where there was still good stuff going on, but there was a certain era that I feel like the church passed through where we were starting to get, aware of psychology and, the need to sort of shake ourselves out of our sort of self-satisfied, culturally conformist ways, which we've gotten rid of the cultural conformity of Catholicism. Well, we're so good at that. I mean,
oh yes, we're so liberated. We're going to hell in a handbasket. We're so liberated.
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah. So, but it's like, so I go through this phase where I'm at a frustrated, dark moment. I mean, like moment, really, that day, maybe a few days, maybe that whole week, where it's just the stress of moving and starting this new job and worrying about whether I'm going to get to the point where I'm contributing. So I just kind of snapped back to some of my old, like feeling bad about things and being really worried about just, God is going to condemn me because I haven't done enough for other people, which, that's an undercurrent in my life. I feel isolated, and I feel like I've just, I feel like the God, the judge of Matthew 25, is it, is going to separate me right along with the goats. And, like, you've done nothing for people. You're going to, there's part of me that's really, really worried about that. So I get, I really can't sum it up better than I get roundly abused for being too hard on myself. Was kind of this guy's, you're a jerk. That's actually pride. And that's, God, it's all about God's forgiving you. What you do doesn't matter. Which, I mean, there is that whole strain of the New Testament that is unquestionable. And I do lose track of that. And and in some sense, I needed to hear that right then. But boy, it was delivered with an attitude of contempt and dismissal at the same time. It was really kind of, So why do I bring that up? Because he gave me 2 books to read. One of them was, what was the book by Henri Nouwen? What was that book? I don't remember. It's sitting in the back seat of my. He gave me the books and said, hand them on to someone else. So I actually have in the back seat of my car in order to hand it on to someone else if the opportunity presents itself. And Henri Nouwen just, I don't know. He's too colorless for me. I can't grasp him in terms of what is he trying to get me to do? What does he want me to change? What does he want me to think about differently? I'm still not altogether sure. It's a vaguely inspiring book, but it's not really the book for me. And then he's handed me a book by Eckhart Tolle. Have you heard of him?
No.
He is
a new
kind of para-Buddhist guru type who hangs around with Oprah and has like a fairly massive commercial machine around his enlightenment business. But he's very in sort of, I don't know, new age circles, if I have to sort of draw that distinction. He's very, he sells a bunch of books for sure. So this book is, and so far, I'm 17 pages into it. He's fascinating because he rides a certain, like, he doesn't go right off the rails into just being ridiculous. He's got a point, and I guess, and I suppose, I must admit that, I already come with having concluded a lot of these things in my own reading of history, that, enlightenment comes in many different figures, and it goes right off the rails because people go into that conformity, into that social conformity. And when you took Christianity and made it an official state religion, you set this time bomb. You set this time bomb. It went off in the Reformation, and then it just kept, things kept exploding. And, by the 18th century, people were ready to be done with religion. And here we are. I mean, the process is just. And
But
I was actually listening
was
to
it the Counter-Reformation?
Well, I mean, the Counter-Reformation couldn't stop that process. It was valuable, and it's given us a rallying point, and we're still here. I mean, that was part of God's plan for the Catholic Church to still be here. But it was time, apparently.
Yes.
I mean, that's my reading of history, is that that was the Constantinian age from about whatever that would have been, 325 to 1519. Was the age when God had Christianity in this, I guess, kind of incubator where it was going to be allowed to be the state religion in Europe, and get a considerable amount of philosophic and other theologic work built up ahead of steam, become a intellectual peer to anything else in the world. And I think the incubator's broken now. I think we're in a different era, and we're going to continue to be in a different era. We're not going back to the Constantinian age.
Right.
And frankly, there's a lot not to be missed about the Constantinian age. I mean, if you go read like Howard Pyle's Robin Hood, and the sort of discussion of obviously it's polemical, but the discussion of the wealth and corruption of clergy, of bishops in particular, people with power, because once you make Catholic clergy, once you make Christian clergy, major landowners and political power brokers, has a pretty negative effect on most of them. Some of them, there are saints will come up in any circumstance, but that was a bad environment with a lot of people who set very bad examples.
That's right. Talk about avoiding the near occasion of sin. We didn't do a good job of it back then.
Yeah, and Tolle refers to that. Yes. I mean, that's he points this out, and and you think about the sort of attitudes that that are forged in that environment, where you don't necessarily really believe in everything that Jesus had to say. You sort of wrap yourself in a Jesus banner, but you're not really necessarily believing in the harder things that he had to say, or the things that don't lead to social conformity in some ways. That's
right. Right.
But that's, I mean, and of course he is a committed sort of syncretist / somewhere between every religion is equally valuable, but but you have to pull out of it what I think is really important. What's really important is this enlightenment,
right?
Yeah, is this enlightenment business that I'm going to define for you, and that I'm hoping is going to. I mean, his whole thing is that he thinks that world civilization has gotten to this point where we're ready to for a lot more people to become enlightened and more Christ or Buddha like, and that we'll let go of so much war and conflict and whatnot. Which he's both observing original sin, and yet he's missing the critical feature that we're never going to be rid of it. He's allowing himself the pipe dream of the utopian dream. I mean, and he seems to be, he either just has, or he's about to launch onto a discussion of secular utopias. Like he's mentioned communism in very condemnatory terms. That was trying to do these things in a materialist fashion. So I mean, again, like Pinker, it's like it's like I can see a lot to agree with this guy. I can, he's making some pretty obviously, potent and pertinent points. The other point of reference was I've been reading a lot about EMDR therapy, or I've been listening to an audiobook by the woman who founded EMDR therapy back in the 80s. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't know.
So
I don't know about
eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. So the idea there is that there are things that you can do by, among other things, stimulating your peripheral vision. That this is actually why we have rapid eye movement during sleep, is that it's literally part of our part of our human nature to process the memories of the day or the week, or however
Right.
There's no particular limit on what could be being reprocessed during dreams, but that we need memories
Right.
need this sort of like post event handling in order to become an integrated part of our psyche, and that a lot of problems come when that process goes wrong. And that there are people who can, who have struggled in psychotherapy or, and don't respond to drugs, whatever else, that have been helped by this specific. It can be your peripheral vision. It can be sort of like physical stimulations on either hand or either leg, or I think maybe even noises to either side. But there's something about this, needing to, process bilaterally that's part of how this works, apparently. So I've been listening to this and thinking about, this long-term project I've been on myself, in terms of thinking about what has happened to me, the experiences that I went through as a child, the things that I did and did not get as a child, that are, that's another form of original sin. Everyone goes through, and that's a point that she makes. Like it doesn't matter how loving and, dedicated your parents were. They're going to make mistakes, and things are going to happen to you that were outside their control, for that matter. Both of those are true.
Yes.
Things are going to happen to you that they had no idea would cause this, because it's not a predictable process who will and won't, process a memory. It can be as simple as, like getting left at school when you're 6 years old and your parents show up 2 hours late. Like some kids will process that, and some kids it'll get stuck there and affect them for decades.
Yeah. Yes.
To say nothing of, physical abuse or sexual abuse or, any of the other sort of big ticket items. It can be really small things, and it's just not. And that's, that comes back to what I was saying about we have a human nature, and it just goes wrong sometimes. We live in an imperfect, imperfect bodies with imperfect minds in an imperfect world. And there's, things that happen to us that then we can do, we can do sinful and terrible things even under the influence of these, that's the Christian drama, right? That Paul talks about in Romans. Why do I do these things that I don't want to do?
Yes.
Which that's, a key, passage in the understanding of what original sin is actually about in terms of our day-to-day life. The people have pondered ever since, and certainly in the 20th century, plenty of people have looked at it and found it to be a very, very pertinent and insightful look at what human nature is and how it works.
So now, how does that original sin concept, affect our everyday life differently, just because it's a much more expansive view of original sin than the Catechism might?
I don't know.
Entail,
I'd kind of stick a bookmark in that and go read the Catechism and say, is that really that much more expansive than what the Catechism says, or is it just?
That would be very interesting. Yeah.
Am I just sort of saying the Catechism spreads out this pretty big tent for it? It does. I think it's pretty too tempting. It's right over here. It's right over here.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm going to guess that it's
looking at me.
I'm going to guess that it's quite broad in one way, at least, in that it encompasses all of human pride and the human desire to be, one's own God, and also susceptibility to the spiritual temptation to doubt God and to lose trust. Okay, well, I like that. Okay, I can see that.
The fact that original sin is going to route us over to just sin, like that. That in itself suggests that this is going to wind up being pretty broad. Oh yeah.
Yes, although we're freed of our enslavement to original sin in baptism, but I guess that's the whole idea of concupiscence, that we've still got the basic traits of original sin.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
fomes
I
peccati,
guess
I
I do need a
believe.
little bit of a refresher for it.
I believe that's a classical term that we still have. I mean, because it's true, I mean, that's a, since there's been any number of Christians, we've been faced with the what's the word that I'm looking for? Paradox doesn't really, the scandal that there are people who go through baptism and are still behave in all these rotten ways. Man and sin, afflicted by sin from birth, 403. Following St. Paul, the Church has always taught that the overwhelming misery which oppresses men in their inclination toward evil and death cannot be understood apart from their connection with Adam's sin, the fact that he has transmitted to us a sin with which we were all born afflicted, a sin which is the death of the soul. Because of the certainty of faith, the Church baptizes for the remission of sins even tiny infants who have not committed personal sin. 404. How did the sin of Adam become the sin of all his descendants? The whole human race is in Adam as one body of one man. By this unity of the human race, all men are implicated in Adam's sin as all are implicated in Christ's justice. Still, the transmission of original sin is a mystery that we cannot fully understand. But we do know by revelation that Adam had received original holiness and justice not for himself alone, but for all human nature. By yielding to the tempter, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected the human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. As a sin which will be transmitted by propagation to all mankind, that is the transmission of human nature deprived of original holiness and justice. That's why original sin is called sin only in an analogical sense. It is a sin contracted and not committed, a state and not an act. A sin in the ordinary sense is an act, right?
True. Yeah. And I like the idea of sin being primarily, as in terms of our own ability to judge sin and its effects. I'm a little bit concerned about especially today's tendency toward judging people as sinful and downright evil, not just on the basis of particular acts or particular behaviors, but on one's kind of psychological analysis of that person, a kind of snap judgment that this person is in some way evil. The Church never prescribed that, right? It never told us to, think that, this person is clearly going to heaven or this person is clearly going to hell.
Right.
And I'm afraid that once we lost God in a lot of people's calculus, we lost that distinction between the person and the person's behavior.
Oh yeah. Once we could let ourselves unmoor from Jesus, judge not that ye not be judged, all this stuff can come flooding back in.
Right. Yeah. Oh, the judging is haywire now. It's epidemic. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I mean, that was, I think that with the Constantinian age I was talking about, I mean, it's not like it's hard to find examples of people being profoundly hypocritical about that, teaching of Christ, in, say, the 13th, 14th, 15th century, ready to condemn all, I mean, certainly all Jews or all Muslims or all,
Lordy,
what have you. Or even their fellow. I mean, Dante's largely joking, but Dante wandering through hell. There's more people here who speak with a Bolognese accent than there are actual people in Bologna in this particular corner of hell, because they're just that bad people.
It sounds like he was practicing cancel culture by placing people in different rings of hell, different rings of hell. Huh?
Yeah. There's probably a reason why Dante hasn't been canonized. I mean, I've seen a book that is a devotional book that is based on the Divine Comedy, as well there should be. I mean, the Divine Comedy was central in my own conversion experience. I mean, I think that's the experience of a lot of people. Yeah. But people can produce beautiful things and not have their whole life quite rise to that standard of or at least, their life in retrospect, right? Because it's not their whole life. Obviously, we don't judge Augustine by his whole life. We look at where he came to in the end. But,
exactly.
Yeah. So Dante, even at the end of his life, doesn't necessarily quite rise to that level. We should probably still pray for him, although he's probably had enough people pray for him by this point that he's probably handing graces over to other folks in purgatory by now. But
yeah. But so just to draw as the new press secretary for Biden likes to say, to circle back to where we started, I'm wondering whether your concern about original sin is in a broader, newer context than it was, just in more, in recent days or in recent circumstances of your life, or is it raising new questions, or?
I mean, it just gives me new perspective. The perspective that I've gotten over, in particular, the last 3 years that I've been, thinking about my own experiences in childhood. That and knowing that everyone goes through,
I see, right?
And like I said, that the whole idea, the phrase that her name is Francine Shapiro. She's passed away in the past decade. But the book is called Getting Past Your Past. And honestly, I'd strongly recommend it to just about anyone with the slightest concern about their own mental health, honestly.
Yeah.
Or the mental health of someone they know and care about. Or certainly anyone who's, got children who've had some sort of issue that, they think could potentially be helped in any way by any form of therapy, because it's amazing the sort of corners this can reach into, apparently. But the whole concept of the phrase she uses over and over again in that book is, what's running your show? That there is, that these things that are involuntarily, because I mean, that's fundamental to original sin. Like, the passages that I just read, it's involuntary. We don't get to choose whether we're dealing with it. And even after we've been baptized as an infant or as an adult, even infants, even those baptized in infancy have those fomes peccati that I'm almost certain that phrase is somewhere. It may be in a different passage. The listener who's interested in this, I was reading from the early 400s numbered chapters in the or sections. What are those officially called? Are those just section numbers or paragraphs? They're probably paragraph numbers in the Catechism of the Catholic Church from the early 90s, from like 1994, I think is when it was promulgated. But so it's also comes up elsewhere. That phrase may come up elsewhere, because this is the early part that's about the creed. And so, of course, it also comes up in the context of, life in Christ, the 10 Commandments. That part is based on the 10 Commandments. So that's, I think, in that area, it also comes up several times. So, yeah. But yeah, it's what is involuntarily, so what is original sin in that sense? The fact that we're susceptible to this. I mean, after all, what was the consequence of original sin for Adam and Eve? That they were going to experience physical death, right? And that's, so the fact that we're susceptible to physical death, it's kind of like the American legal principle that the power to tax is the power to destroy. You flip that around a little bit, the ability to die is the ability to go physically wrong, rather than going from the small to the great, to go from the great to the small. But, that we're subject to all of these, ways of going wrong that we would not have been in the state of original bliss, whatever that is. However, Adam and Eve's, original state, whatever that is, whatever universe that was in. I sometimes go down a very twisty, path of speculation about where was Eden? Was it even in this physical universe? I mean, what is that? And in particular, I would love to have someone I would love to have about 10 someones, because I bet I get 10 different opinions, but people who are, very knowledgeable about the book of Genesis, the Hebrew that was used there, what words, what textual variations there are, and that particular thing is like, and he positioned the cherub with the fiery revolving sword. What on earth is that an image of? What on earth was that an image of?
Revolving sword.
But that's it is. And unlike almost every other aspect of that story in Genesis, I don't know of anybody who's picked up the fiery revolving sword and done a big. I'm sure some father of the church commented on it at some point in some more or less crazy speculative fashion. But what does that mean? Does it mean nothing?
Yeah.
If it means nothing, what does Scripture mean then?
Well, I love the fact that you're asking these questions, but what interests me also, just as a kind of more journalistic, sociological observer, I'm still caught up by the fact that these analyses of sin are, almost now uprooted from any grounding in Catholic wisdom or traditional understanding, and we define, too many of us define what's right for ourselves, and then define what's wrong for ourselves and others. And while concupiscence makes perfect sense, at least there's the element of forgiveness. But folks who are nuns or atheists or agnostics in some sense, they don't have the capability to distinguish between behavior as sin and the essence of the person as sinful. And I don't think people make the distinction between original sin and just plain old sin.
Oh no,
they probably don't even call it sin anymore.
Yeah, it's a phrase that it's questionable whether that exact phrase was ever the best pedagogical tool to sort of convey the concept. It's possible.
Oh, interesting.
It's possible.
Yes.
I mean, to emphasize the point that I just read from the Catechism, it is not a sin in the ordinary sense. It is not an act.
Yeah.
It is a state, not an act. It's involuntary, not voluntary.
Well
we don't
said.
get
That's
to
right.
choose.
Yeah, it's a state. Yeah.
So it's possible that,
Right.
in this new millennium, we may need to look at it and say, you know what, that is an obstacle for people's understanding. We should change it. It's not, that's not a fundamental, it's not a fundamental aspect of faith that we call it that exact phrase. But, there was something more substantive I wanted to say in response to your comments there. It's when you the question of like defining things for ourselves, there's part of me that always, that kind of rolls my eyes at that. I mean, and sometimes sometimes even at people, who are, really on my side, as it were, Orthodox Catholics, or at least we're all trying to be,
Right.
Who defines things for themselves? We're contingent. If I'm trying to define something for myself, if I'm trying to define my gender for myself, I'm not trying to define my gender. I'm not succeeding. I may be trying. Maybe I am trying. But I'm not succeeding. I am a contingent being who's formed by, the base level, my genetics, but then all of these experiences. This is a point that Francine Shapiro makes too.
That's
yes,
right.
genetics have an effect, but genetics is more like it'll lean you one direction or another. But for you to actually start the actual, forming experience is going to be an experience. You're going to be formed specifically by the experiences that you have, the things that people specifically tell you, the things that you specifically experience. And genetics is almost kind of like drugs. The problem with drugs is that they're so non-specific. You take a pill and your entire system is bathed in, some quantity of that chemical. You can't, and of course your body has all these sophisticated systems that haul that chemical preferentially to certain places. But, you take it in, you take a pill, you take an injection, and you lose control over where it goes. It's a very blunt instrument, a medication.
Yeah.
Very blunt instrument. And genetics is like every cell in your body carries that genetic code. It's a very blunt, it's like the canvas that you're painting on. You can paint, you need different kinds of canvases, or at least different kinds of background colors. Maybe I can make that, analogy. You can start with different base colors, and that will affect what the quality of your final painting will be. But, the details of it are where you put, that brush with that dab of red paint. It's not the greatest metaphor,
right,
but I think you see at least a little bit of where I'm going.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, original sin is in some sense that kind of, background. It's one of the background things. It's one of the aspects of all of our canvases, is that we do have that tendency toward choosing the wrong thing. It looks good to us. We're deprived of understanding of, and we're deprived of understanding. We're deprived of control. In our natural state, we need grace, in order to function, and we don't have that, and of course it's not like Adam and Eve didn't need grace either, but, they had it from the beginning and then did something to unplug from it. And so that's what's carried on, is that we're naturally unplugged from it. And it takes some sort of effort on our part to respond to God's, because it is responding to God. That's Christian, that's Orthodox Christianity as well.
Yeah.
We have to respond to God, and God is always acting. There is not, never has been, and never will be. This is another line that's quoted from a first millennium council in the Catechism. Not an ecumenical council, oddly enough, but a council. There is not, never has been, and never will be a human being for whom Christ did not die. It's, the defect is never on God's side.
You're grounding it in catechism and traditional understanding, which is new to, somewhat new to me, or at least I need a refresher course. And I'm coming at it a little bit more from just my concerns about the eagerness of people today to make judgments about sin in ways that seem disconnected from tradition and from church wisdom, and of course the whole idea of forgiveness for sin and understanding of a person's journey through a life of sin, but still open to forgiveness and oneness with God at the end. All of those things need to be recaptured if we're going to recapture the idea of sin.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That's So Second Millennium. TSSM's audio producer is Morgan Burkhardt. Our theme music, Igneous Grok, was composed and performed by Vin Marquardt. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Until next time.